Hi, welcome to Tabletop Oddity. I'm Katie and today I'm going to show you how to make swamp terrain like in Dagobah where Yoda lives. So this would be quite good for Star Wars Legion, which is why I've made it. So this was actually cheaper than it first looks. It used DAS clay, EPVC base and some epoxy resin from the pound shop in the DIY section. So it's quite cheap and this is what I did. Alright, start with using the EPVC base. You could use MDF. It was approximately 6x4. I started by drawing like a squiggly, terrainy type style outline. Once I'd drawn the outline for the base, I then cut it out using a Stanley knife. Do be careful while using a Stanley knife as they are quite sharp. Then once it was cut out, I beveled the edges with the Stanley knife. So once I beveled the edges, it's time to make the outline of the swamp. So we did this by getting some DAS clay. I then made it into a sausage style shape and glued the base and placed the DAS clay around the base and then squidged it down so that it would get to the edges so that it looked a bit more of a natural swampy pondy shape. So did the DAS clay all the way around. At that point it then needed to dry overnight. Then once it was dry it was time to paint it. So we started by painting the pool area of the swamp, so mixed a dark green and a dark brown together. Once they were mixed together, it wasn't primed, so it was a little bit streaky and I did end up going over it again later. So to save time you might want to prime it. And then made two like darker circle bits on the pool area of the swamp so that it looked deeper in certain areas. It was then time to make a mixture for the outside of the swamp. So for the dirt around the swamp, we used PVA glue, some filler, some brown paint, some sand and some ballast. So the sand and the ballast was just like some grit. So mix these together till they made quite a thick paste. So once the mixture was quite thick, I then squished it around the edges using a lolly stick and then evenly distributed it all around the edges, trying to avoid any white areas where possible. So once it was all the way around the swamp, it was time to let it dry. So once all the swamp was dry, it was time to glue on some vines so that it was in keeping with the Yoda house. So got some string, cut it to size and placed some around the swamp. I did them mostly going into the swamp. I hot glued the vines, but you can PVA them, so do be careful if you're using hot glue. Then once I'd glued on the vines, it was time to do a dry brush. I did two different shades of dry brush, quite a light brown and then an even lighter brown after that. Then once I'd done the dry brushing, I did another coat in the middle of the swamp because you could still see some white bits. And then made the vine colour, tried to get it as similar to Yoda's house, trying to keep the terrain in keeping. So I used the dark green and the buff titanium paint and mixed them together with a little bit of brown. So painted up the vines to make it a little bit more interesting, but also to keep it in keeping with Yoda's house. And then glued on some lichen into certain areas. I did it over the vines just so it wasn't obvious where they were going off on the board. I then did some blobs of glue and put some flock onto the swamp area. That then needed to dry. So once that was dry, I tapped off the flock so there wasn't any loose bits left. I then got a dark wash and did the vines and also the darker areas in the swamp to make it look slightly deeper. I did a wash on the vines again to keep it in keeping with Yoda's house. That then needed to dry. So this was the most complicated bit. We used a 2-part epoxy resin that we got from the pound shop, so wasn't very expensive. And we then made a watered down green paint to try and put some colour into the resin. We don't think that we mixed the resin as quickly as it should have been. It had quite a few air bubbles in it, and then when we poured it into the pool, I probably poured it a bit slowly as well, so it did bubble up on one of the edges. It's up to you. You could probably do a second layer if you wanted to, but I've not done at this point. We might do off camera just to see if we can make it look better. But that was it then, done. And that's how I made the swamp terrain. Since I've put a second layer of resin in, which I've got to be honest, it looks quite a lot better now it's got a second layer of resin. So I'd probably recommend 2 layers of resin. Thank you for watching the video. Please like and subscribe. There will be more terrain, Star Wars Legion terrain content in the future.